June 5, 1944. The English Channel was a restless, black sea under a sky of bruised clouds. A cold wind swept over the gray docks of Portsmouth, rattling chains, tugging at canvas covers, and carrying the bitter smell of salt and oil. Private Thomas Keegan stood in the dark, helmet straps biting into his chin, staring at the strange, low wooden boats bobbing against the pier. They didn't look like the machines of an empire about to reclaim Europe. They looked like toys, flat, boxy, awkward. Someone behind him muttered, "We're supposed to ride those into hell?" The men laughed nervously, but no one really found it funny. Each boat was squat, with a blunt nose and a metal ramp hanging in front like a drawbridge from a child's sketchbook. The paint was dull gray-green, already scuffed from salt spray. They looked more like fishing barges than war machines. The Germans had tanks, artillery, coastal guns as large as houses. And America? America was sending its sons to the deadliest beaches in the world, in what looked like glorified swamp boats. They had names, though few knew them yet: landing craft, vehicle personnel, LCVPs. But everyone just called them Higgins Boats. The name didn't inspire awe. Not like Sherman Tank or B-17 Flying Fortress. The word Higgins sounded almost comic, like the name of a neighbor who fixed outboard motors on weekends. It was hard to imagine that these boxy craft would soon face the Atlantic surf, German mortars, and a continent bristling with steel. A German officer, months earlier, had sneered when intelligence photos showed these wooden barges being built in American shipyards. "They expect to invade Europe in fishing boats?" he laughed. "Let them try." To the German high command, they were an engineering joke. Unarmored, flat-bottomed, unfit for open water. One Luftwaffe analyst called them floating coffins. Another mocked their construction. Plywood and nails against the Atlantic wall? Ridiculous. Even some American officers agreed. When Andrew Jackson Higgins first brought his idea to Washington years before, naval bureaucrats had waved him off. His designs, they said, were crude, noisy, and unstable. His factory was in New Orleans, not a naval shipyard. He wasn't even a trained naval architect, just a Louisiana boat builder who'd spent years designing shallow draft boats for loggers and fishermen in the bayous. To the polished men of Washington, he was an outsider with a loud voice and a temper to match. But in the dark that night, on the eve of D-Day, it was those outsider boats that lined the horizon. Hundreds of them, rocking gently in the harbor, their wooden hulls creaking, engines growling as mechanics checked fuel lines and soldiers loaded crates of ammunition. The smell of diesel hung thick in the air. The sound of water slapping against hulls mixed with whispered prayers. Thomas ran his hand along the side of one boat. The wood was cold, damp, rough where it had been repaired. It didn't feel like armor. It felt like a coffin wall. Somewhere a chaplain's voice drifted, low and steady. Overhead, the distant drone of C-47 transports echoed through the clouds. Paratroopers were already on their way across the channel. The Higgins boat, for all its plainness, was deceptively clever. The secret was not strength, but shape. The flat bottom let it glide through shallow water, over sandbars where other ships would ground. The steel ramp at its bow could drop in seconds, turning the front of the boat into a bridge. Infantry, jeeps, even small tanks could rush directly from sea to land. But tonight, none of that mattered to the men waiting to board them. To them, they were about to sail into gunfire in boxes built of wood and hope. One sergeant squinted at the boats and spat. "Hell of a way to get across a beach," he said. "Feels like we're the bait." Another replied, "Maybe the Germans will laugh themselves to death." A few chuckled. Nervous laughter again. They didn't know that somewhere in Berlin, men really had laughed. The irony was thick as the fog that crept along the water. The Germans had built fortresses of concrete and steel. America had built boats of plywood. But as dawn approached, those wooden shells would carry the weight of a world's hope. Far across the channel, on the French coast, German sentries watched the dark waves. One of them, a young corporal named Mahler, leaned on his rifle, scanning the sea through binoculars. He saw nothing but mist and foam. Somewhere inland, his commander had once joked, "If the Americans come, We'll drown them before they reach the sand. Muller had laughed too. The very idea of an army trying to land directly on their beaches seemed insane. But insanity has a strange way of working when genius hides inside it. Andrew Higgins had been called many things: loudmouth, lunatic, stubborn. But in the muddy backwaters of Louisiana, he'd spent years solving a problem that generals hadn't yet realized existed. He had seen how boats could slide across shallow swamp water without snagging, how a ramp could turn a hull into a doorway. When the Marines tested his design before the war, they found it could carry 30 men or a jeep and drop them on a beach faster than anything the Navy had. Still, most officials shrugged. Too simple, they said. Too unorthodox. Yet here it was, the unorthodox answer to an impossible question. The night deepened. The men climbed aboard. The engines rumbled awake, coughing plumes of smoke into the cold air. Across the harbor, an officer shouted orders through a megaphone. Lines were cast off. One by one, the Higgins boats drifted away from the docks, vanishing into the darkness toward the waiting invasion fleet. Thomas took a seat on the wooden bench, clutching his rifle tight. The deck vibrated beneath his boots as the engine roared. He looked down at the floorboards, water already sloshing in a thin layer across them. He thought of home, of his father's fishing boat on the Ohio River, and felt a strange comfort. The sound was the same. The smell of oil, the slap of water, the hum of machinery. But this time the water led to war. Above the sound of the engines, a voice shouted, "Remember the plan. When the ramp drops, keep moving. Don't stop. Don't stop." The boat rocked harder now as they left the calm harbor and hit the open channel. Spray splashed against faces, stinging eyes. The horizon was a smear of darkness. Somewhere out there, on the other side, waited a wall of guns. And between them, this fragile boat. In Berlin, perhaps someone still laughed. Perhaps a colonel with a brandy in hand said the same words as before. They think they can storm Europe in fishing boats. But the laughter would not last the night. Because in a few hours, those same fishing boats would be delivering men by the thousands onto beaches coated Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. They would brave waves, bullets, and fire. They would turn a continent's coastline into the doorstep of liberation. And the name Higgins would echo not as a punchline, but as a legend. 3 short truths hung in the air like sparks before dawn. They mocked a wooden box until it carried an army. They laughed at a swamp boat until it conquered an ocean. They doubted one man's idea until it changed the fate of the world. By sunrise, the Germans would stop laughing, and the Higgins boat, born in the muddy bayous of Louisiana, would land the greatest invasion force in history. Before it ever touched the sands of Normandy, the Higgins boat nearly died a dozen quiet deaths in Washington conference rooms. Long before the war, before generals memorized the shape of Europe's coastlines, Andrew Jackson Higgins was just a restless shipbuilder in New Orleans. His workshop was filled with the smell of pine sawdust, diesel fuel, and cigar smoke. He cursed louder than his engines and drank harder than his workers. But his boats worked. Fast, light, able to glide over the shallow, treacherous bayous where larger vessels would sink or stall. He called one of his designs the Eureka boat. It could skim over reeds, run up on mudflats, and back out again without grounding. He built it for loggers, for oilmen, for fishermen. Never for war. Not yet. But war has a way of finding those who solve problems others haven't yet named. In the late 1930s, the U.S. Navy was struggling with an old truth. Its ships were made for deep oceans, not for landings. If America ever needed to invade a coast, it would need something that could carry men from ship to shore fast, shallow, and expendable. The Navy had prototypes, but they were clumsy. Soldiers had to climb over the sides to disembark, making them easy targets. When Higgins heard this, he laughed, then shouted, "Climb over the sides? Hell, I'll give you a ramp." He sketched it in chalk right on his workshop floor. A square bow, a metal door that dropped forward. Soldiers could rush straight out. No climbing, no delay. He didn't ask permission. He built it, and when he showed it to the Navy, they frowned. One officer sniffed. Too simple. It won't survive rough water. Another muttered, "He's not even one of us." Higgins slammed his hand on the table. "You don't need a gentleman to win your war," he said. "You need a boat that works." Rejection followed him like a shadow. Military bureaucracy moved slow, choking on red tape. But Higgins didn't stop. He had faith not in paperwork, but in results. He and his crew, dockhands, carpenters, welders, fishermen, kept hammering, cutting, and testing. They painted over cracks, replaced rotten planks, and worked 12-hour shifts. He mortgaged his home, borrowed against his company, shouted himself hoarse. "If they won't buy it," he told his men, "we'll prove it." Then came a small miracle wrapped in desperation. The Marine Corps had heard whispers about Higgins's boat. Their commanders needed something, anything, that could carry men onto the coral reefs of the Pacific without grounding. They sent officers to New Orleans. Higgins met them on the dock, sleeves rolled up, shouting over the roar of engines. "You want a landing craft? Watch this." The boat surged forward across the muddy river, hit the shallows, and glided up onto a sandbar without slowing. Higgins pulled the lever, the metal ramp dropped, and men poured out, running, shouting, rifles in hand. It was fast, brutal, efficient. The officers were speechless. One finally said, "Can you make 100 of them?" Higgins grinned, cigar clamped between his teeth. "I can make you thousands." But even as orders trickled in, the old doubts remained. The Navy still preferred its own designs. They said his boats leaked too much, that plywood wasn't military grade. Higgins spat the words back like poison. "You can waste years building your perfect boat," he barked. "But my boys are already landing on beaches." His faith was rewarded in 1942. The first Higgins boats entered combat in the Pacific at Guadalcanal. The seas were rough, the beaches narrow, the reefs sharp. Traditional craft would have shattered. Higgins's boats, with their flat hulls, skimmed over the coral and dropped Marines right on target. The ramp fell and the first wave charged ashore. One sergeant shouted afterward, "If it wasn't for that boat, we'd still be swimming." Word spread through the ranks faster than the tide itself. The reports reached Washington and finally Eisenhower. The general had been watching the slow, brutal progress of amphibious warfare. Every operation depended on one thing: getting men onto the beach alive. When he saw the Higgins design, he immediately understood. "This," he said, tapping a finger on a photo of the wooden craft, "is how we're getting back into Europe." But before D-Day, there was still blood to pay. In North Africa, 1942, American forces tested the boats in Operation Torch. The Mediterranean swelled under the morning sun as waves of Higgins boats churned toward Algerian beaches. Some hit underwater rocks. Others drifted off course. Men vomited from the motion, soaked and terrified. The ramps dropped under fire, bullets pinging off the metal plates. But the landings succeeded. The system worked. Commanders saw it. The design wasn't pretty, but it delivered men faster than anything else in the war. Still, Higgins himself faced battles of a different kind. He clashed with Navy bureaucrats over contracts, fought to secure materials, cursed steel shortages, and demanded racial integration in his factories years before it was fashionable. His New Orleans plant became a thunderous temple of production. Thousands of workers pounding, sawing, welding. He didn't care about background. He hired black workers, women, immigrants, anyone who could build. "This war," he told his supervisors, "isn't about who you are. It's about what you can do." By 1943, the Higgins Industries workforce had exploded to over 20,000 people. The factory floor glowed with sparks. Wooden frames lined up like skeletons waiting for skin. Assembly lines ran day and night. It smelled of sawdust and hot metal. Each boat was tested in the Mississippi River before being shipped out. Higgins himself stalked the docks with a stopwatch, barking at workers, praising those who kept pace. "You're building history, boys," he'd shout. "Faster, faster. The army's waiting." But history moves only when courage meets proof. The Pacific proved the boat's worth, but the European commanders remained skeptical. Could these lightweight craft survive the Channel's savage waves? Could they hit Normandy's beaches under artillery fire? The arguments dragged on. Some British officers dismissed them as wooden coffins. American naval engineers still muttered about improper hull stress. Then came a test off the coast of Devon, England, in 1944. Higgins himself crossed the ocean to watch. The sea was cold, gray, and rough. Dozens of his boats lined up against the swells, engines roaring. As they advanced, the waves smashed over them. One dipped low, then rose again, steady, cutting through the surf like an angry beast. They reached the shore. The ramps dropped. Soldiers charged out, rifles raised, boots splashing through surf. Higgins turned to a skeptical officer beside him. "Still think it's a toy?" The officer said nothing. The truth was loud enough in the engine's roar. Higgins had turned the impossible into standard procedure. His boats were no longer bayou oddities, they were invasion weapons. They could carry 36 men, a jeep, or 8,000 pounds of cargo. They could run up a beach, unload, and reverse out in seconds. Every bolt, every plank, every inch had been tested by sweat, salt, and time. The struggle had burned him, though. Years of shouting at bureaucrats, fighting for materials, defending his vision had left Higgins worn but unbroken. Reporters asked him if he felt vindicated now that his boats were being mass-produced. He smiled, tired and proud. "They said a man from the swamps couldn't change the Navy," he said. "Well, the Navy changed to keep up with me." As spring 1944 arrived, the docks of southern England filled with his creation. Rows upon rows of gray, boxy boats. Soldiers trained on them daily, running drills, dropping ramps, loading supplies. Mechanics greased engines. Carpenters patched hulls. Officers mapped tides. The Higgins boat had evolved from a joke into the backbone of the Allied invasion. And yet, the question remained, could they face the real thing? The channel was no bayou, no Pacific lagoon. It was a storm of cold and fury. Higgins stood on a pier one morning, wind whipping his coat, watching his boats slice through the surf. He said softly to a young officer, "They laughed at me, son. Let's see if they laugh tomorrow." Somewhere far away, on the cliffs of Normandy, German gunners waited behind concrete walls, unaware that the very fishing boats they mocked were coming for them, by the thousands. And every one of them carried men who would change history. The invention had survived its ridicule. But the test that mattered most, the one against gunfire, against the Atlantic, against fear itself, was only hours away. Dawn broke not as light, but as thunder. The English Channel was a living beast that morning. Heaving, snarling, pounding the flat-bottomed boats with waves that slapped like fists. Higgins' boats, hundreds of them, bobbed and jolted in chaotic formation, each packed with men whose faces were pale beneath helmets slick with seawater. Diesel fumes choked the air. Spray stung eyes. The roar of engines merged with the growl of distant guns from the French coast. Above them, clouds hung low and gray, shot through with the faint glow of tracer fire. It was June 6, 1944, D-Day, and the world was about to discover what a wooden boat could do. Private Thomas Keegan clutched the edge of his seat as the boat lurched forward, rising and slamming down hard on another wave. The sound was deafening. Metal clanking, water slapping, men coughing and retching as they gripped their rifles. To his left, another soldier vomited into the bilge water already sloshing around their boots. The coxswain yelled over the engine, voice raw, "Hold on tight. 2 minutes. 2 minutes until the ramp would drop. 2 minutes until hell." All around them, the Higgins boats advanced in waves of gray-green rectangles, engines pounding like war drums. From a distance, they looked fragile, even pitiful, tiny wooden craft charging toward fortress walls of concrete and gunfire. But inside, they were iron-willed. They carried not just soldiers, but the momentum of an entire civilization clawing its way back onto a continent. Ahead, the beaches came into view: Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juneau, Sword. Smoke rose from the shoreline like dark banners. The Germans were waiting. Bunkers flashed with the muzzle glow of MG-42s. Mortars exploded geysers of water around the oncoming boats. The sea hissed and boiled with shrapnel. One Higgins boat ahead of them took a direct hit, A flash of fire, a scream, and then it was gone. Splinters and debris rained across the waves. The others didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The invasion depended on momentum. 30 seconds, the coxswain shouted. Men braced themselves. Thomas felt his heart hammering like a piston. He could hear the bullets pinging against the bow, the wooden hull shuddering with every hit. The smell of smoke and salt filled his nostrils. He tasted metal and fear. The Higgins boat surged into the shallows, its flat bottom grinding against sand. "Drop the ramp!" the coxswain screamed. The metal door clanged open, and chaos erupted. The first men stepped forward and vanished, cut down instantly by machine gun fire. Others stumbled over them, plunging into waist-deep water, rifles held high, eyes wide with terror. Thomas leapt, hit the icy surf, and forced himself to move. Around him, men screamed, bullets hissed, water turned dark. The boat rocked as more jumped out. Still, the coxswain kept shouting, "Go! Go! Go!" The Higgins boat was not a shield. It was a bridge from one world to another, the line between waiting and fighting. Up and down the coast, the scene repeated thousands of times. Ramps fell. Men surged forward. Boats reversed, their propellers churning bloody foam, then turned back toward the troopships for another load. Higgins boats moved like ants in a storm, ferrying life into death and back again. German commanders had seen the early photos of these craft months before and laughed. Now, staring through binoculars at the endless rows approaching from the horizon, they weren't laughing. One panicked officer near Vierville-sur-Mer shouted into his radio, "See common Uberall! Uberall! They're coming everywhere!" To the defenders of the Atlantic Wall, it seemed as if the sea itself had sprouted teeth. From the decks of larger ships offshore, Allied officers watched in awe. Destroyers pounded the beaches with artillery, trying to clear paths for the landing craft. Overhead, aircraft streaked through clouds, dropping bombs in rhythmic bursts. And through it all, the little Higgins boats kept coming, weaving between wreckage and flame. The statistics, later recited in textbooks, couldn't capture the madness. Over 4,000 landing craft, most of them Higgins's design, carried 156,000 men across that strip of violent gray water. They delivered tanks, jeeps, ammunition, and medics. Some made a dozen trips under fire. Each boat held 36 souls, some barely out of high school, some hardened from Africa or Italy, but all trusting that this awkward wooden contraption could carry them through hell's front door. On Omaha Beach, the tide turned red. Higgins boats grounded themselves in chaos, men unloading into fields of fire. Dozens were destroyed, but for every one lost, 2 more arrived. The boats didn't stop. They multiplied. They became a machine of flesh and wood, surging endlessly toward the shore. The German bunkers that had once laughed at fishing boats now found themselves overwhelmed. Further down the line, at Utah Beach, the design's brilliance showed its full worth. The flat hulls rode up onto sandbars where other craft would have sunk. Men poured out, running through shallow surf. A sergeant later wrote in his diary, "It was the damnedest thing I ever saw. We hit the sand, the ramp dropped, and we ran like we'd rehearsed it 1,000 times. That boat made it possible." In the command ships offshore, Eisenhower received constant reports. His aides described how even in the worst sectors, Higgins's boats were pushing men ashore faster than the enemy could react. He said nothing for a long moment, then looked out the window toward the horizon, his face unreadable. Finally, he murmured, "Andrew Higgins is the man who won this war for us." It was not hyperbole. It was truth whispered through exhaustion and awe. For the men inside those boats, though, victory was measured in inches. Every wave forward felt like defiance. Thomas crawled behind a beach obstacle, breath ragged, looking back toward the surf. More boats were coming, endless rows cutting through smoke, fearless. He saw one hit by artillery, break apart, yet the survivors swam forward. Another glided in beside it, ramp already dropping. There was no pause, no hesitation. The sea itself seemed to deliver men faster than the enemy could kill them. That was the miracle. Not that the boats survived, but that they refused to stop. Their simplicity was their strength. A damaged boat could still function. A hole in the side could be patched with planks or tin. A dead engine could be replaced overnight. They weren't machines of elegance. They were machines of persistence. By midday, the beaches were clogged with wreckage, destroyed vehicles, broken boats, and the dead. Yet behind it all, more Higgins boats kept arriving, turning the tide from desperation to dominance. The mockery that had once filled briefing rooms in Berlin now echoed as silence. One captured German lieutenant later said, "We never believed they could land so many men so fast. It was as if the ocean itself brought them." Each ramp that fell carried 1,000 small victories. Each wooden hull that reached the shore pushed the front line closer to liberation. The tide of men was unstoppable. Even when the sea turned red and the air filled with the shriek of shells, the boats came on, simple, loyal, unyielding. By late afternoon, Allied troops had clawed their way inland. The beaches, those impossible fortified death traps, were theirs. Behind them, in the surf, hundreds of Higgins boats floated scarred, bullet-riddled, some burning, some half-sunk. But many still moved, heading back to the ships for another load. Their wooden sides were torn, their ramps twisted, yet they still carried life forward. That evening, as the sun bled orange into the sea, the noise began to fade. Smoke drifted over the water. Waves lapped at the wreckage. Thomas sat on the sand, exhausted, staring at the sea now calm and cruelly beautiful. He saw the shapes of the Higgins boats bobbing in the distance, ghostly silhouettes returning to the fleet. They looked peaceful now, almost gentle. He remembered how they'd laughed at them, the floating coffins, the bathtubs, and yet, those same wooden shells had carried them across hell itself. They weren't pretty, they weren't armored, but they had done what no weapon of steel or strategy could do. They had carried courage to shore. Out beyond the breakers, one last Higgins boat turned slowly toward England. Its ramp hung crooked, its hull blackened by smoke. But inside, its crew still stood at their posts, eyes on the horizon. The war was far from over, but the impossible had been done. The Germans had laughed. Now they watched their Atlantic wall crumble before wooden boats that refused to die. The sea that had once divided the world had become a bridge. And in that bridge, hammered, nailed, and dreamed into existence by a stubborn man from New Orleans, lay the turning of the tide. By the time the smoke cleared over Normandy, the sea was littered with wreckage, burned-out hulks, shattered planks, and the ghostly remains of hundreds of Higgins boats that had done their duty. The tide rolled in and out, washing over bullet holes and blood, as if the ocean itself were trying to erase the violence it had carried. But it couldn't. The scars were too deep, the memory too vast. What had begun as a fishing boat joke had ended as the vessel that brought an entire army onto Hitler's doorstep. In the days following D-Day, Allied engineers surveyed the beaches. They counted the wrecked craft, the spent shells, the twisted obstacles. For every Higgins boat that had sunk, 10 had made it through. Their simplicity was their salvation. No fancy steel plating to warp, no complicated engines to stall. Just wood, nails, and guts. Crews patched holes with scrap boards, replaced engines, and sent them back to work within hours. The invasion depended on them, and they delivered. Behind the front lines, supply officers and planners began to grasp the magnitude of what had just happened. More than 20,000 Higgins boats had been built by that point, and most of them had been scattered across oceans, carrying troops in the Pacific, Africa, Italy, and now Europe. Each one bore the same square bow, the same front ramp, the same defiant spirit of its creator. In a war dominated by bombers, tanks, and battleships, it was a wooden box that proved indispensable. Back in New Orleans, Andrew Jackson Higgins received the news with a mixture of pride and exhaustion. His factories had worked around the clock for years, hammering, welding, and painting through the heat of southern nights. Over 85,000 workers, men and women of every color, had passed through his doors. For many, it was their first job that paid a fair wage. Higgins didn't care about race or background, he cared about output. He once told a reporter, "If you can drive a nail straight, you can build freedom." His plant became a symbol of what America could do when arrogance gave way to necessity. Lines of black workers and white workers, men and women, stood side by side in coveralls, riveting hulls and assembling engines. They sang while they worked, sweat dripping onto sawdust-covered floors. For them, the Higgins boat wasn't just a machine, it was a promise that every piece of effort mattered. When Eisenhower's words reached him, "Andrew Higgins is the man who won the war for us," he reportedly leaned back in his chair, puffed on a cigar, and grinned. "About damn time somebody noticed," he said. But there was no champagne celebration, no parade. He knew what the boats had cost. He'd seen the reports. Thousands of his craft had gone down with men inside. His triumph was soaked in sacrifice. In the following weeks, as the Allies pushed inland from Normandy, the Higgins boats kept coming. They ferried supplies, medics, ammunition, even tanks. They crossed rivers, harbors, and canals, transforming from invasion tools to lifelines. Soldiers began calling them our angels of wood. To the weary men who survived the beaches, the sight of a Higgins boat meant salvation. Food, reinforcements, escape. The irony was inescapable. The very design that had been mocked by naval architects, laughed at by German intelligence, and doubted by the military establishment had become the foundation of victory. Once they called it a bathtub with a ramp. Now, they called it the boat that won the war. The insult had become its crown. But innovation always comes with a price. When the war ended, demand evaporated overnight. The assembly lines fell silent. The great New Orleans factories, once glowing with sparks and echoing with the rhythm of hammers, stood empty. Workers who had built history returned to ordinary life. Higgins himself faced bankruptcy within a few years. The Navy, once his fiercest critic, moved on to new technologies. His name faded from headlines, overshadowed by generals and politicians. He didn't care much for titles or medals, but the quiet bothered him. He had always been a man of noise, a storm in human form. Now, without the roar of engines and the shouts of foremen, he found himself adrift. "We gave them the tools to win," he told a journalist in 1947. "But I guess they've already forgotten who made the tools." Still, the legacy was unshakable. Every invasion that followed, from Korea to Vietnam, borrowed from his blueprint. The flat-bottom hull, the front ramp, the concept of delivering men straight from ship to shore, it all began with Higgins. His idea outlived him, reshaped amphibious warfare, and inspired generations of naval engineers. For the soldiers who had ridden those boats through fire, his name carried a different kind of reverence. Veterans who met years later in VFW halls or reunions would look at each other and say, "We got there on a Higgins. It wasn't just a boat. It was the threshold between fear and courage." In 1952, when Andrew Higgins passed away, his obituary was brief. It mentioned his factory, his boats, and Eisenhower's famous line. But the papers didn't capture the larger truth, that one man's defiance had changed the course of history. He hadn't been born into privilege or education. He hadn't worn a uniform or led troops in battle. Yet through his stubbornness, he gave soldiers their bridge to destiny. Years later, when historians walked the beaches of Normandy, they found the remnants of his work. Rusted bolts, wooden fragments half buried in sand. They studied the landing craft preserved in museums and marveled at their simplicity. Each one told a story of mud and salt, of sweat and courage, of an idea too strange to succeed but too perfect to fail. The insult that had once followed his name, that crazy Cajun boat builder, became part of the legend. It reminded everyone that genius rarely wears the right uniform, that innovation often comes from those the system overlooks. The Higgins boat was proof that brilliance can come wrapped in stubbornness, profanity, and sawdust. Decades later, a Marine veteran visiting the National World War II Museum stood before one of the last surviving Higgins boats. He reached out, ran his hand over the rough wood, and whispered, "You brought me home." The craft sat silent, its gray paint faded, but it didn't need to answer. Its work was already written in the sand of history. In museums across the world, children now climb inside replicas of the Higgins boat. They grip the ramp's handle, feel the cold metal, and imagine what it was like to face the guns of Normandy. Guides tell them about Eisenhower's quote, about Higgins's factory, about how a wooden box changed everything. But the real lesson lies deeper. It's not about war. It's about persistence, vision, and the courage to build when everyone laughs. When the last of the D-Day veterans were interviewed, many of them brought up those boats unprompted. One old man, his voice trembling, said, "We were scared stiff, but when that ramp dropped, I thought of one thing. Some American somewhere built this thing for me to get to shore. That was enough." History is full of marvels of engineering, but few carry the soul that the Higgins boat did. It wasn't elegant or fast or beautiful. It was honest. Every plank and rivet bore the fingerprints of ordinary people building something extraordinary. Carried not just men but faith itself, the belief that even against impossible odds, something simple and strong could deliver victory. And so the story comes full circle. The Germans laughed at a wooden boat. The Navy dismissed it. The world doubted it. But on the morning of June 6, 1944, that same bathtub with a ramp stormed through bullets and breakers and delivered freedom onto a hostile shore. The laughter stopped, the mockery turned to respect, and Andrew Higgins's vision became immortal. In the end, every generation repeats the same pattern. They mock what they don't understand. They doubt what doesn't fit tradition. Yet progress always comes from the outsiders, the dreamers who refuse to listen. Higgins was one of them, and because he refused to quit, millions reached land who never would have otherwise. Perhaps that's the real moral of the story. History isn't written by the comfortable, but by those who build in defiance of comfort. The world laughs at their madness, until the day that madness saves it. One statistic remains as the quiet monument to his genius. By the end of World War II, 92% of all U.S. Navy vessels were designed by Higgins Industries. 92% from the swamps of Louisiana to the shores of Normandy. They laughed at his wooden boats. He built a fleet that freed the world. And so, as waves still crash against the beaches of France, a single question lingers in the wind. One for the next generation to answer. Which invention today will the world mock, until it wins tomorrow's war?